Hello, everyone. My name is Kyle Benaz. I'm the Director of Marketing at Netreo, and I'm also joined by my colleague, Andy Markowitz, our Technical Product Manager. Today, we'll be discussing tips and tricks to cloud infrastructure monitoring. Before we get started, I just want to cover a few housekeeping items. So everyone on the webinar today is in listen-only mode, but we do like to keep our webinars interactive. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to ask them using the question section of your GoToWebinar control panel, and we will answer those as they come through. We've also allotted some time at the end of the webinar for live Q&A. So with that, let's get started. Okay, so on the agenda, we'll first go into a small bit of background on the subject area. Then we'll discuss some of the challenges we've heard about from our customers and others with regard to getting visibility into cloud resources. After that, we'll dive into specifics of cloud monitoring and how to tackle these challenges. We'll provide some tips, tricks, and general best practices worth pursuing in your own environment. And as I just mentioned, we like to keep things interactive. So if you do have any questions, please go ahead and ask those in the GoToWebinar panel, and I'll make sure we get them all to Andy for getting them answered. So with that, let me turn the presentation over to Andy. Andy, the virtual floor is yours.
Thanks, Kyle. So good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you may be signed in from. Thanks for joining us. So when looking for topics to discuss in our webinar series, we get our ideas from a variety of sources. However, the two most common are going to be products we've released or planning to release in the near future, and then direct conversations with our customer base. Now, in the case of this particular topic, it happens to be a little bit of both. Our operations and support organization is starting to see a higher frequency of customers dive into AWS, dive into Microsoft Azure, right, and then other vendors for the purposes of deploying resources in the cloud. Now, consequently, more and more questions are starting to come up in terms of getting cloud and hybrid infrastructures monitored. Similarly, right, as we progress through our product roadmap, we've got features under active development that are concentrating on this area of technology as well. So this webinar felt like just another opportunity to expand upon both topics, so here we are. Now, in the interest of brevity, I'm going to make the assumption that everybody attending today has at least a cursory knowledge of what the Netreo IT management solution is and what it does. For those of you new to Netreo, again, thank you for your time. And secondly, at the conclusion of this session, please let us know if you'd like additional information, and one of our account executives will get in touch with you. All right, so first we'll go into a tiny bit of background here. What exactly is cloud computing? I mean, we know it's all the rage right now and all the cool kids are doing it, but what does it really mean? So just so we can level set and make sure that we're all working off the same explanation, for the purposes of this discussion, I'm defining cloud computing as the on-demand availability of computer system resources without direct active management by the end user. Now, the overall idea behind cloud computing isn't particularly new, right? I mean, companies like Exodus and Verio were around during the time of the dot-com boom, and their value proposition was, look, you don't want to be in the business of managing all the headaches that come with running a data center, so pay us, and we'll handle things like power and AC and bandwidth and even remote hands if you need it. You just worry about your customers. Now, co-location facilities are still very prevalent among today's IT landscape. I guess in a way you could think of cloud computing as one evolution of the co-location facility, but on a much, much larger scale. Now, of course, there's a lot more to cloud computing than just really massive co-location services, right? There's a number of different cloud services now offered by vendors. So you've got infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service, right? And then the newest, right, function as a service. Now, the most fun example I could find when describing the differences between all of them was comparing them to automobile transportation, right? So first you have infrastructure as a service. This would be the closest cousin to the aforementioned co-location facility. In a nutshell, you're renting virtual machine computing resources from the vendor. This is very similar to leasing a car. You don't own it, but you can drive it anywhere you want, anytime you want, within reason and according to local laws and regulations, but I digress. Now, next, you have platform as a service. This type of service is basically computing resources you rent that provides an environment for developing, testing, and managing applications. Now, you don't have any visibility into hardware or low-level details. You just know the service is there to help you run your applications, right? So this is not unlike a taxi service. You don't drive the taxi yourself, but you tell the driver where you need to go and then just sit back and relax. Now, the third type of cloud computing resource is software as a service. This type is the most easily identified, and honestly, I'd be shocked if anybody listening in this session doesn't take advantage of this type of service at either a personal level or in a professional capacity. It's a shared service that you log into with credentials, and it's meant to perform a purpose-driven task, right? That's it. So as a user, you have no knowledge of any details under the hood. It's comparable to riding a bus. Buses have assigned routes, and you share that route with other passengers. Now, last on the list is function as a service. This type is the relative, as I was saying, this type is the relative newest kid on the block. It's essentially a serverless computing paradigm. Oh, great, right? What does that mean? Application developers effectively write blocks of code and then submit it to the vendor for execution based on certain conditions. So for example, run a shopping cart program every time your user clicks on an item to purchase. That's simplified, but you get the idea. Now, in terms of the transportation analogy, the best example I could think of was something like a handheld satellite radio receiver. Regardless of how you get from point A to point B, you could carry such a device with you and then get services. Right, so what you see here inside the cloud image are 4 types of cloud resources represented, right? Magneto is an e-commerce platform used by many companies. Lambda is an AWS implementation of function as a service. And then of course, there's Netreo with our Netreo Cloud Monitoring SaaS product. Now, of course, the topic at hand today is the monitoring of Microsoft Azure and then AWS resources, which are features we have already released or will be releasing in the near term, right? So we have Azure Functions, which are the analog to AWS Lambda. There's the AWS S3, or Simple Storage Service, which is mass scale and elastic disk storage that lives up in the cloud, right? Let's say you wanted to host a web application that lives in AWS. ELB stands for Elastic Load Balancing. So rather than deploy a load balancing product, from F5 or A10 into your AWS infrastructure, you can just take advantage of the services that AWS already provides. And then of course, down there in the corner, you've got Microsoft 365, which allows you to outsource your end user productivity suite to the cloud as well. Now, there are myriad benefits to transitioning your organization's IT resources into the cloud, even if only partially, right? Now, according to the most recent Flexera RightScale State of the Cloud report, 58% of companies employ a hybrid cloud strategy, up from 51% a year ago, right? And at least from the perspective of this humble product manager, I don't see that trend tapering off anytime soon, right? All of that said, the move to the cloud doesn't come without its challenges, and monitoring is potentially one of them, but why? Right? The first is environmental complexity, right? This challenge is more prevalent in hybrid environments rather than a 100% cloud native IT architecture, but that represents the lion's share of organizations anyway. So if you take a look at this graphic from research firm Gartner, right, I'm sure most of you are familiar with them. Right now, if you consider all the elements present, it isn't that extreme of a depiction. I mean, who out there, listening in hasn't heard of Salesforce, right, for a CRM application, or hasn't heard of SAP for for an ERP application, right? Those are companies primarily that live up in the cloud. There aren't on-prem components, and those are crucial parts of business. Now, getting a single comprehensive view of all your IT resources, regardless of whether deployed, can be difficult, right? I mean, perhaps your company subscribes to several SaaS services, runs Exchange and some other applications on SharePoint solely in Azure, right? But then you also have to maintain on-premises gear for one department that still uses a mission-critical legacy application, and it can't be replaced, right? In a scenario like that, the how, what, and where of monitoring is not an easy question to answer. Right? Now, one of the nice things about adopting cloud-based resources is that typically it's as simple as a few clicks of a mouse in a browser window to spin up and or destroy resources. And in a microservice architected environment, you don't even need that. Resources can come and go automatically based on application need, right? In the case of FaaS functions, right, they run often consuming resources for less than 100 milliseconds and then disappear again. That's certainly convenient for developers and it's great for customers, but it's potentially a nightmare to try and monitor. If your NMS system isn't ready for prime time, you're going to have challenges. Now, last on the list is real service availability, right? How do you know if things are really working or not? With the exception of infrastructure as a service, none of the resource types I've already mentioned give you visibility to operating system level metrics. When those vendors do provide service status and performance data, it's from the perspective of their infrastructure, not your infrastructure, and most certainly not your customer's infrastructure, right? That's problematic, and it can be and it's an issue that does need to be addressed when it comes to cloud monitoring. Okay, so let's get into some of the things we think are best practices with regard to monitoring AWS and Azure Cloud stuff, right? So we're going to start with availability, right? Now, when I say availability, what I'm specifically referring to is the binary state of a given resource. Is it available or is it not available? This needs to be the first level of any monitoring solution, and that makes logical sense because if the resource isn't available, then nothing else about it matters, right? Now, depending upon the types of cloud resources you've deployed, you'll want to track up-down status of your VM guests and OS level services. But if you've deployed function as a service, then it's necessary to track the result of that function, right? Did it do what it was supposed to do? The answer to that question is also binary in nature. And the same is true of synthetic transactions. Did the transaction work or did it not? If you've deployed all these types of resources, then the availability for each should be checked. Right, so what we're looking to achieve here isn't necessarily whether or not a given resource is up. It should be obvious why that's important, right? Rather, what we're looking for is availability from multiple perspectives to ensure that things are working as they should. Now, as you can see in this screen print, the easiest way to get that kind of insight is to take advantage of Azure, the Azure Setup Wizard in Netreo Essentials, right? By simply providing Netreo with credentials to your Azure tenant, all the resources available for checking will be detected, and you'll have the opportunity to get them configured for monitoring. If you're using AWS, you simply have to provide the appropriate credentials to your AWS organization, and then upon discovery scanning, all your relevant resources will be added to your Netreo deployment. Okay, so the next area we want to look at from a cloud monitoring perspective is performance data. Now, the distinguishing element here, as opposed to availability, is that performance data is some kind of a time series metric, right, that we can use to judge how healthy a given resource is. In other words, we already know the resource is up, but what kind of shape is it in? Right? A term that's gained popularity over the last several years as cloud computing has become more prevalent are the so-called golden signals. Now, regardless of your source for reference materials on the topic, you're going to find some variation of this list. Now, although these terms may seem self-explanatory, they are worth quickly enumerating, right? Request rate, it's simply the rate of requests made to your resource per second. Similarly, error rate is the rate of errors generated by your resource per second. Latency is how long on average it takes for requests to be serviced. Saturation asks the question, how overloaded is my resource? And then lastly, utilization asks, how busy is my resource over time? And that's usually expressed as a percentage from 0 to 100, CPU utilization, for example. Now, aside from the metrics themselves, there's a couple important characteristics to note. The first is that what we're talking about here is resource agnostic. For example, error rate could just as easily apply to a FaaS function as it could apply to a web page that serves content to the end user, right? Now, the second is that oftentimes these signals are indirect measures. In other words, it's not likely you're going to look at an API reference for a vendor and see in big bold print, look at this value for saturation levels, right? Instead, the actual statistic in that case might be measured by something like disk queue length or something like that. The point is, in order to set up this kind of monitoring, personnel are either going to likely have to know something about the application, or you're going to have to get some developers and or other engineers involved who does know the application, right? And because it's ultimately them who are going to be able to tell you how things are behaving, okay? So, why do these metrics matter? Why isn't it simply sufficient to say, hey, I want CPU utilization on resource X and I want free disk space on resource Y? Now, the truth is variables X and Y may very well tell you something, but without additional context, you're going to have to do more digging. You can think of it as almost a bottom-up approach to ferreting out the problem. Whereas using the golden signals, you're working top-down, right? Now, the reality is the latter metrics, right, the golden signals, those are directly what affect your end user and output-producing parts of the system. These are the things that impact what your users perceive as the effectiveness of your application. So the $64,000 question is, how do you get there? Well, ultimately, you need to find the variables that will allow you to derive the information you need, right? As with availability, like I mentioned a moment ago, Netreo Essentials has a setup wizard, which can show you all the metrics that are available to track. Now, you combine that with some application know-how and you're off to the races. For AWS, everything that's available to learn from the CloudWatch API will be pulled down, right? Now, what we currently have in the development queue right now is to make sure is to make Azure monitoring more automatic and build out support then for more AWS metrics, such as things like transit gateways and SES queues and VPC gateways, stuff like that.
Hey, Andy, sorry to interrupt here, but it looks like we have a question that came in from the audience. So what kind of access permissions does Netreo need to get these metrics to show up in the UI?
That is a phenomenal question. So in terms of Azure, in Netreo, you need an Azure Active Directory account with administrative privileges or be allowed to create service principals, right? And then also have owner or contributor permissions to the tenant. Now for AWS, we highly, I can't say that enough, highly recommend deploying a centralized, what's called IAM plan, or identity access management plan. And then the user you configure in Netreo needs to have either the administrator access policy or a CloudWatch full access policy. Now, AWS does offer the ability to piecemeal permissions for particular users and particular variables. But again, in the opinion of this humble product manager, that's just more trouble than it's worth in terms of maintainability for monitoring your IT environment.
Awesome, thank you, Andy.
Yeah, good question. All right, so another crucial aspect of cloud monitoring is going to be something known as telemetry. Now, telemetry is diagnostic and performance information metrics, right, that are pushed into your management system rather than pulled. They're then analyzed and consumed by your technical personnel or other tools. Now, there are a couple of technologies you want to be aware of. The first is something known as an Azure Event Hub, and it's actually an event processing cloud service that can ingest millions of events per second and then make them available for storage and analysis. So it's doing all the heavy lifting and then giving your monitoring system the quote unquote good stuff, right? Now there's enough variations where I could probably dedicate an entire webinar just to Event Hub visibility alone. But for the purposes of this session, just that telemetry and stuff like that, it's an important part of your monitoring strategy. Now, the other element I've noted here are the traditional sources of telemetry data feeds. Those are going to be things like syslog, Windows event logs, SNMP traps, from whole VMs within your environment. Now, these protocols, they've been around since before I've had a driver license. So they've been around a long time, and they're most likely going to come into play with legacy applications. Now, legacy or not, I mean, regardless, right? Telemetry it can provide you with a wealth of information in terms of the health of your applications. So they certainly shouldn't be overlooked. Right, so by adding telemetry sources into your monitoring setup, right, you're guaranteeing full coverage, both push data and then pulled and time data, right? And that's ultimately going to help you track the health of your applications. Now, the Netreo Essentials configuration wizard, it will detect what Event Hub namespaces exist in your tenant, but you can just as easily add them manually to your deployment.
Hey there, Andy. So we do have another question that came in from our audience. Does Netreo support NSG flow logs?
Interesting. So the short answer to this question is not yet. Right now, for the uninitiated, NSG flow logs are a clever, alphabet soup acronym, and it's short for Network Security Group Flow Logs. Now, for the folks listening in that might have a network engineering background, they probably know that NetFlow traffic collection is an extremely useful telemetry-based protocol that provides traffic accounting information like source and destination ports, volume of traffic, and all sorts of other goodies. NSG flow logs are basically that, but they track traffic information between Azure resources. AWS has something similar it refers to as VPC flow logs. We're evaluating both technologies now, and do intend on getting them included as features into upcoming releases of the Netreo software.
All right, great question. Keep those coming in.
Awesome. Okay, so of course, monitoring is only part of the story, right? We need to be concerned about notifications from your resources and then integrations to other management tools you may have deployed as well, right? Now, quite simply, when we say notifications, what we're talking about is data observed by your management system and then having it acted upon in some manner. Now, there's two primary ways these actions manifest themselves. The first is ITSM ticket creation, which is typically done either via webhook API calls or through direct email message to an SMTP gateway. Obviously, this also means that direct emails could be sent to human recipients as well. Now, the second are automations, or what we've always referred to in the Netreo world as active response, right? So rather than send an email or open up a trouble ticket, you actually have your NMS take action in response to a problem. And I'll expand on that topic in a few minutes here. Now, when it comes to notifications, right, the other thing to be cognizant of is that you want to do your best to configure your system to generate actionable alerts only. What does that mean, right? Hyperbolically speaking, right, unless you are prepared to drop everything you are doing right this minute, right, get up from that meeting, stop surfing Facebook, doing whatever you're doing, unless you're prepared to drop all of that and address the problem, don't have it send an alert, or don't open up a trouble ticket, right? And I'll expand on this topic in just a second as well. Now, as I previously alluded to, right, watching your resources is only part of the equation to keeping your Azure tenant and your AWS organizations in tip-top shape. Action is imperative, whether that means runbook automation or integrating your IT service management system with tools and applications that you have running, right? Stuff that you have running in your chosen hosted environments. Now, Netreo Essentials integrates, I think at this point, the count is up to 20 ITSM tools, and then a bunch of other tools to help you integrate your NMS system with other stuff, right, that might be running or that you might be relying on to run your organization. And the integrations dialog within that UI makes it easy and intuitive to set those things up. Now, a close cousin, the closest relative to the idea of notifications and integrations is the concept of NMS reporting. Okay, now they're not analogous, right? But notifications and reporting do complement each other quite well, right? Now, what we're talking about here is the extraction of data from your NMS for decision-making and action plan purposes. And there's 3 reasons this reporting is important, right? The first is the idea of visual dashboards into your environment. Now, what I have here in this screen print is an Azure blob storage dashboard from a test lab environment. Now, it quickly shows me at a glance, right, availability, and if you can make out in the rather small print, 2 of the golden signals I mentioned earlier, holder requests, right, and then the resource response time, right? The point here is that dashboarding is an essential part of any monitoring strategy. Now, the second reason noted here simply says persona specific. Basically, when you generate what I've come to call tearaway reports from your NMS system, that data should likely be geared towards specific roles within your organization. Now, maybe that means a summary of Azure billing and overall system uptime for your IT leadership on one hand, or a report of active incidents for your NOC operators to triage on the other. Right now, the last reason mentioned, and I would argue the most important of the 3, right, with regard to reporting, is that it helps you with noise abatement in your environment. Now, when I said a second ago that you only want to have your system configured for actionable alerts, that doesn't imply you don't want to be notified about problem conditions. Rather, the better place for non-important, non-urgent notifications is in structured periodic reports that let you prioritize and address issues on an as-needed basis, right? And I would be shocked, again, I would be shocked if anybody listening in this session hasn't experienced a problem with alert deluge from monitoring systems, right? I mean, when you look at your inbox or an ITSM ticket queue and there are 100 issues awaiting action, stuff is going to get missed, right? Now, for anybody else that's listening who's ever heard me talk about alert deluge and this particular problem, there's another way I've taken to describing this particular issue, right? In the Pixar movie, The Incredibles, the antagonist makes a comment when he's monologuing. He says, I'm just going to sell my technology, right? And once everybody is super, then nobody will be, right? The same concept applies here. Think about it. If every single alert you receive is critical, well, then nothing is critical, right? Stuff's going to fall through the cracks. Okay, so, we talk about why reporting matters to your environment. The why should be self-evident, right? 1, you don't want to miss incidents, right? 2, you're going to reduce MTTR if you are staying on top of all of these issues, right? And then 3, you're likely going to have higher satisfaction from your end users and your customers. Generally speaking, right, the wider the visibility, the better. Now, in terms of getting you there, all levels of the Netreo product offering do have a full complement of report types and setups, right? They can be run ad hoc. Things can be run on a scheduled or delivered where necessary. If you're monitoring a very large environment, or perhaps you have strict reporting requirements, right? Then Netreo also offers the ability to templatize your reporting, right? So what that basically means is your data queries are separate and distinct from your data visualizations. And the takeaway there, right, is that it lowers the administrative burden of having to deal with reporting, but then it also increases your flexibility, right? Now, regardless of whether you run a 100% native cloud environment, if you're on-prem only, or it's some combination of thereof, like we typically see, right? Reporting is it's a super important part of all of this. And yeah, it's just something that you don't want to see overlooked. When I've done build-outs in the past, we always tend to push reporting off to the end. It's like, oh, well, I'll deal with reports later. I'll deal with them later. No, they are so important and it's so crucial to your environment. You really do want to give some thought to it because it does tie into everything else.
All right. So Andy, it looks like we have another question here from our audience. So it's actually kind of a two-part question, but is there integration in the other direction? Meaning, what if I'm using a different tool, but I want to see the data visualized in Netreo?
Yeah, actually, so Netreo Essentials does have the ability to do that. As part of the integration features, you can go the other direction, right? You can publish metrics that are collected in Nagios, Zabbix, Microsoft SQL Server, or even Microsoft SCOM to the Netreo UI, where you could then take advantage of the reporting that we have built in, of the active response we built in, right? Because it's raw data. So the raw data is going from one system to another, and then you can take advantage of all of Netreo's analytics. Excellent question. All right, so the last area that I want to talk about with regard to cloud visibility and management is that of cost control, right? Now, from where I sit, right, this topic qualifies under the heading of tips and tricks because, well, who doesn't want to save money, right? Now, keeping IT operational costs under control, it's something that's likely on the mind of every IT leader. And with the uncertain business climate these days, it's even more prevalent than times past. So there's three aspects of cost control that I want to focus on here. The first is cloud resource auto discovery. The second is automated response and scheduled actions. And then finally, I want to get into the idea of resource orchestration. I'm going to elaborate on all three of these for a quick second here. Right. So the first resource is auto discovery. Right. Now, team efficiency is at the heart of this particular challenge and this particular issue. Right. While most, if not all, tools designed to monitor cloud resources will handle automatic discovery, there's more involved than that. Once the resources are discovered, how do you classify them? How should they be configured with regard to alerting and reporting? Now, we talked about the high resource churn rate when it comes to cloud monitoring in general. If you've moved to the cloud, yes, you've likely been able to take advantage of technologies that would be cost prohibitive if you deployed them on-prem. But if you're still reliant on your engineering staff to do manual configuration after discovery, there's a lot more cost savings to be had. Now, Netreo can get you there as part of its base feature set in every version of the product. Now, also related to the idea of team efficiency is a scenario after your resources have been discovered and configured. Do you have the ability to fire off automated responses? I talked about this a little bit, right? The ability to fire off automated responses to incidents and then execute scheduled actions, right? If not, then it should also be high in your priority list of enhancements to your environment. You know, one customer I was recently talking to told me that it takes him 5 hours of data mining to prepare reports for his bi-weekly operations meetings, right? Wouldn't this time be better spent troubleshooting issues and enhancing the environment and pulling data together, right? And over the years, I've heard other similar things. I mean, you know, I'm not going to go so far as to say typical, because I'm not doing build-outs anymore, but I've heard stories from other engineers say, you know, when alert XYZ comes in, we know that the solution is for us to log into the server and restart that particular service. Why not just have your monitoring system do that for you, right? I mean, the point is there are efficiencies and thus cost savings to be had by taking advantage of capabilities that can deal with rote scenarios, right, like that. And they should be built into the tools that you manage with your environment. You're going to be in a much better position. Right, now the last subject I want to tackle with regard to cost control is that of resource orchestration. Right, so what exactly is it? You can basically think of resource orchestration as the combination of the previous two cost control topics, right? It's a way to get all your cloud resources to play nice together as a single cohesive entity, right? For lack of a better word. You know, not only are you dealing with the auto discovery and configuration of your environment, but then you're also dealing with how it behaves from that point forward. Now, something to keep in mind, and this is important, right? When we're talking about resource orchestration, we're no longer just in the realm of monitoring your cloud environment, but rather application design as a whole, right? And then monitoring is a very important piece of that. Right now, the technology that's most closely associated with resource orchestration is something known as a microservices architecture. Great, more words, right? more fun terms. So what exactly are microservices, and what is a microservice architecture? Well, a picture's worth 1,000 words, and I've included that here because if I drone on for another 1,000 words, I'm likely to put most of you into a boredom-induced coma. Probably the easiest way to think of a microservice is that it's a small, manageable, quote-unquote, chunk of an otherwise large application. Now, those chunks then all talk to each other, usually via RESTful HTTPS API calls. Right now, there's a number of benefits that come with deploying applications using microservices. I've listed some of them here, right, and they should be fairly self-explanatory. Now, this is important within the context of this webinar because microservices are a natural fit to the types of services, right, that are offered to customers by Microsoft Azure, AWS, Google Cloud Platform, and other providers. Now, if you look at the advantages, right, then I think you can plainly see there are areas where organizations can use microservices to help control their costs, right? For example, with microservices, right, all your components can be language independent, right? That means there's a higher likelihood that you can use staff you already have on hand to transition to this type of architecture rather than recruit new and potentially more expensive development expertise, right? Now, another huge advantage is the idea of scalability. When we conjure up the word scalable architecture, we typically mean how do we grow the application to serve more customers and end users? But scalability works in the other direction as well, right? I mean, on-demand resources with cloud providers are typically very costly, which means if you don't need them, you can spin them down and save your organization, a bit of money in the process. Think about Black Friday and Cyber Monday with all these retailers that are out there. They're going to need more resources during Christmas shopping, right? But as soon as the Christmas shopping season ends, they can spin some of those resources down. Now, I think it's important to note that transitioning your applications to a microservices architecture is not a panacea, right? It's not a silver bullet. It's not going to magically make everything better. There are downsides associated with it, okay? I mean, to start with, look at that picture, right? From a networking perspective, connecting all of the various components up to each other is complex. Another disadvantage is, server and database overhead, right? In your traditional 3-tier setup, you've got one database server, one application server, maybe a server for business logic and so on and so forth, and then the UI, right? Each microservice typically runs isolated on their own instances, and then you're relying on a layer higher to connect everything up. Now that said, right, all of this complexity can be mitigated by other technologies that have recently come to the forefront, right? Now, both AWS and Azure offer as one of their cloud services something known as Kubernetes orchestration, right? Otherwise known as EKS for Elastic Kubernetes Service, and then AKS, which is Azure Kubernetes Service, right? Now, released in our Netreo Essentials platform is the ability to monitor AKS to get you full visibility to your application, right? And all those pieces that were depicted in that picture there. And we have on our roadmap a plan for a future release, the ability to get the same features for EKS as well. That is not present right now. Now, I think the big takeaway here is that if you're in a position where it's time to update a legacy application or onboard a new application for your team, microservices is something you want to give a serious look to, right? And of course, if you are a Netreo customer, it's something we can help you with. But ideally, you're listening to this webinar and you're not yet a Netreo customer. This is something we can absolutely help you with. We've done it for other customers. We are currently doing it for other customers, and it's something we can certainly help you with when the time comes. All right, so that wraps up the material I had prepared for this presentation, but let me take a moment or two and open things up for additional questions.
Yeah, so Andy, I'm not seeing a whole lot of questions, so we have a thank you for the presentation. Nick, you are absolutely welcome. Thank you so much for attending today. So I don't see any other questions coming in through just yet, so maybe if we do want to move on, I know we do have a couple more slides.
Yeah, sure, no problem. Right, so as is usually the case, we like to take advantage of these webinars to bring you all up to date on news and notes about Netreo, right? So So this first one, scratch at infinity for Toy Story fans out there. Are you getting the impression that I like cartoons and I like Pixar? So rather than to infinity and beyond, it's to the cloud and beyond. And mentioning that just because, right, the feature that I just mentioned, Netreo Azure Kubernetes Service, right, it's now available in the Netreo Essentials product. It's part of the basic feature set, right, and there isn't any kind of extra license to purchase or anything to get it. Now, also with regard to cloud monitoring and visibility, I'm currently putting together specifications for, Rev 3, Rev 4, of our AWS and Azure feature sets. So if anybody is listening in, right, are open to a conversation about capabilities, what you would like to see added to the product, things that would be useful, maybe willing to share what your pain points have been in terms of monitoring stuff you have up in the cloud, I'd be extremely interested in having a discussion on stuff that, would make your life easier, quite frankly, from a monitoring standpoint. So the next announcement is 50% off 1 year of Netreo Essentials with this particular the coupon code, right? So Netreo Essentials is our cloud-focused product, which is meant to, although it does do some on-prem monitoring, it is meant to be cloud-focused for the folks that have deployed their infrastructures completely up in AWS and Azure. So that's that promotion is running through the end of the year, right? And then the last announcement we're going to make is the idea, what we're calling, competitive swap out, right? Better monitoring, more value, lower cost, right? So, if you've got other tools that are running in your environment, let's say SolarWinds, Science Logic, Logic Monitor, the idea is, give us a shot. Let's spin up a POC. Let's see how this works. Let's see if, we think it's going to be better monitoring. There's going to be more value and lower cost. So, give us a call and we can get the ball rolling there.
Real quick, Andy, I do want to add a few things before we jump into the what and who is Netreo. So to add to those announcements, so for anybody who signs up for a Netreo Essentials free trial, so it's a 15-day trial, and if you add more than 5 or more resources, we'll actually send you a $20 gift card. So we'd love for you to use the platform, give us your feedback, and if you do happen to love it, like Andy mentioned, you'll get 50% off. Or you can stay at just the basic version and it's free forever. So you can still get that better than Azure native tools cloud monitoring or better than AWS native tools cloud monitoring for free. And then for the competitive swap out program, so you'll also see in the chat, I did add a couple of links. So one is the Netreo Essentials trial link, and the second is a link to request a demo. So if you do meet with a member of the Netreo team and see a full demo of the Netreo platform, we'll also send you a $50 gift card. So just something we're doing. We want to get you all some gifts for the holidays.
Very cool. All right, so just really quickly here for the initiative, for the folks that aren't familiar with who we are, right? Just give just a quick insight into who Netreo is, right? I mean, we are a comprehensive IT monitoring and management solution. We've got a 20-year track record of success with global brands, right, that have trusted us, right, to help them get visibility to their IT resources. And over that time frame, and this is something I'm particularly proud of. I used to be in the customer support organization here, right? We've achieved a 98% customer retention rate. We recently just became the highest rated vendor in Gartner Peer Insights, folks with a minimum of 10 reviews, right? And 100% willingness to recommend from our current customers. So before I wrap up here, let me take one more opportunity to answer some questions you might have.
Yeah, so please feel free to send those questions in, and thank you for everybody who's answering the poll currently. So from a question perspective, seeing lots of thank yous. So Andy, it looks like you knocked it out of the park today. So thank you,
Awesome.
Thank you for joining me. I don't want to be left out for the thank you. So excellent presentation today, and thank you so much to everyone for joining us, especially as we get late into December here. So happy holidays to everyone. Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah. And we look forward to the opportunity to help you as we move into 2021. So with that, Still some more thank yous rolling in, but I don't see any other questions. So with that, we can wrap up just a few minutes early. And I'd like to wish everyone a great rest of their day.
Very, very good. Enjoy the day, folks. Bye now.